Welcome to all our trustees, our members, our guests and friends. We're so excited to be here tonight, and we're really honored to have Laura Owens and Kyle Thurman here with us tonight to discuss the work of Michel Majerus. It's the last week of the exhibition of Michel Majerus' Progressive Aesthetics at ICA Miami, so if you haven't seen it yet, please make sure to make your way over Wednesday to Sunday. The show is still up. It is the first exhibition of Michel Majerus' work in a US museum, so we are really honored and excited to be able to display these works. I would like to introduce our guests tonight. Laura Owens, to my left, is an artist who's based in Los Angeles, and thank you so much for coming. I'm going to cheat a little bit so I don't twist the facts. Laura studied at California Institute of the Arts and Skowhegan School of Painting in Maine, as well as Rhode Island School of Design in Providence. Laura's work has been exhibited internationally, and I'm sure you've come across her work maybe at her mid-career survey at the Whitney Museum in New York in 2017-18 that traveled to Dallas and Los Angeles, as well as there was a large presentation of Laura's work in 2021 at the Fondation Vincent van Gogh in Arles, where Laura showed works. Well, she designed it was an exhibition of Laura's that also included 7 works of Vincent van Gogh and a large wallpaper installation. And maybe the topic of installation will come back up in our talk later today. Kyle Thurman, to my very left, is an artist and educator based in Brooklyn, and he works in painting and sculpture. He studied at Columbia University at Bard in Annandale and Hudson. From 2011 to 2012, Kyle Thurman was also a guest student at the Kunstacademy in Düsseldorf with Christopher Williams and Peter Doig. And in 2019, his work was included in the Whitney Biennial. Some of them might have also seen his work at Central Fine on Miami Beach, where he's going to have a solo show in April. And most recently, his work was shown at David Lewis Gallery in New York. Thank you again both for coming and for making this possible. And I'm so excited to discuss Michel's work. Michel Majerus, just a very brief introduction before we jump in, was an artist who was born in 1967 in Luxembourg. He worked for most of his life in Berlin, and he passed away in 2002. As I mentioned, this is the first US museum show of his work. There were previous presentations of his work at Matthew Mark's gallery in Los Angeles and New York, and the show at ICA covers pretty much the phase of his professional career from 91 to 2002. And 2020 also marked the 20th anniversary of his untimely passing, which was accompanied by a series of shows throughout Europe. I would also like to take the opportunity and thank all the lenders to the exhibition who made this possible, as well as all the supporters. Major support was provided by the Nickel Family Fund. Margarim Schneider Berlin provided major support, as well as the Parrish Collection, Matthew Mark's Gallery, Richard Chang, and Stephanie, Andrew, and Rebecca Reed in honor of Evan J. Reed. Exhibitions at ICA Miami are supported by the Knight Foundation, and I would also like to thank the entire team of the museum who helped in putting this together. So without further ado, I would like to...
Well, first of all, thank you, Steffi and Kyle, for inviting me. Thanks for putting together this show, because it's like so amazing to come to Miami and see all these great paintings and see them all together. I was just up there, and it was like, it's a really good show.
Thank you. Well, thank you for being here.
I mean, it was a long time ago now, but I was at a residency at the Kunstlerhaus Britannien and met a lot of people at the beginning of things happening, which was Margarim Schneider, which is a gallery, a pretty important gallery now in Berlin. First of all, Sharon Lockhart had a residency and couldn't afford to stay, so she invited 10 artists to take her place monthly. So when I was there, I was painting and then did a little painting show in the studio with Lisa and Auerbach. And during that time, I met Stefan Schmidt-Wolfen and was going to Hamburg. I don't remember why, but we were going there. He invited me to then participate in this show. I think I was like a late add-on because he saw the work that I had made at the Kunsthaus Britannien. And so then, but besides that, like in this residency on the first floor was Charlene von Heil, who I met for the first time. We became friends. Franz Ackermann was on the first floor renting a space. And then Neugerum Schneider and just decided to move from Charlottenburg to Mitte, as the Mitte was, the East was just starting to then be this idea where galleries might go. And yeah, I remember vividly meeting him while we were installing because I had made a pretty large painting. I think it was like 8 by 10 feet, maybe 2. I think I showed 2 of them. I can't remember. And he was installing something even bigger. It was like, I thought I had this giant painting, and it was like, oh no, he had something like from the edge of this wall all the way to the end. It was like that one whole floating wall was filled with his art, and it was pretty interesting.
How did you feel when you showed up with this giant painting? It was so much bigger.
With his painting? I think his painting was in sections, but no, it was interesting. I mean, Franz also was making pretty big paintings, but it was a big painting show at a time when that was not what was supposed to be interesting. So Franz and Michel were really the 2 people in Germany of that generation who were doing something interesting, and I think that's why Neugerum Schneider wanted to work with them, because they mostly worked with conceptual artists.
Great, thank you. And I think there's a lot of points we're going to come back to. I just to kind of further introduce also Kyle as an artist of a younger generation. You mentioned that you first encountered Majerus' work actually in 2008, which was after his passing. And I wanted to see if you could share more about that. What drew you to his work?
Yeah, so 2008, I would have been between my junior and senior year of college in New York. And the first place I saw the work was at a group show, Painting Now and Forever Part 2, I think. It's a group show that was at Matthew Marks and Green Neftali. And it was, Part 1 happened 10 years prior, I think, at Matthew Marks and Pat Hearn Gallery. And yeah, I remember seeing the Majerus paintings at the Matthew Marks part of the show. And I guess I was kind of drawn to it because, I mean, this was a time where I was young and kind of like learning about art every day, kind of just consuming a ton. And his work in that show were these 2 vertical, kind of elongated aluminum panels. And one was like looked like the bottom of a skateboard. It had like a skull that was kind of smeared and maybe some text. And the other painting just vertically said the word burned out. And it was kind of painted in this like pastel, kind of off primary palette. And I remember just feeling like there was a familiarity to like the signs and the symbols of his work that I kind of felt like kind of things that I related to more than other types of kind of higher culture art at the time. And it was because of the familiarity of the references, I kind of like didn't trust the work because I wasn't exposed to a lot of art kind of before that. And it didn't seem like what art was supposed to be about. And it also felt like it kind of pulled the rug out from the rest of the work in the room because it was like Blinky Palermo, Anne Truitt, kind of like quite serious, minimal works. And then to kind of like put this work that's at burned out kind of seemed to point to this like exhaustive pursuit of artists and particularly painters to kind of like create something, this kind of creation demand of like coming up with an original idea, and to kind of see his gesture, it really stood out. But then I didn't see the work again for years until I moved to Germany. And it was much more accessible there in European institutions, and even just access to books with his work in it. And yeah, and then I think there were solo shows in New York around 2014 or something, when there was like a renewed interest in his work and other types of painting that he was in conversation with.
Yeah, I think that's both the points you mentioned are really interesting. What you're saying, Laura, that he was painting at a time where painting wasn't really the thing to do, maybe. And I remember coming across his work in 2005 in a giant show, and I remember this huge Marilyn Manson looking at me as I entered the space, and I was like, oh, wow. And it's just kind of been thinking about institutional critique and kind of Xerox paperworks, and that really was crazy. And then the other aspect is the found images. So, I mean, Michel has often been called like a sampler of images and appropriating a lot of found visuals, quoting, really kind of not making necessarily new images, but just recording incessantly. It was like a small digital camcorder, what he would see around him, and like collect all these like ice cream wrappers and laundry detergent packages. And his estate, which is in Berlin, kind of has this archive of all this ephemera that he collected and then incorporated into his work. And I wanted to see, so the working with found images, Laura, in many of your works, you also include newspaper snippets or bumper stickers or little snippets from archives and found images. And similarly, Kyle, you have also made a series of works that was at the Whitney Biennial, Suggested Occupation, that does work with newspaper images. And I wanted to see if you could talk more about the strategy of using found images in Majerus' work, but also from your personal perspective, what that entails and how you incorporate that into your work.
Well, just to confirm kind of the feeling you had in that show that you saw, that it in some way was sort of making this rupture with other work that had a kind of serious, taking a serious tone. Even you're even saying like a Blinky Palermo, which is kind of funny, like that would feel like really serious high art compared to that. I feel like when at the Wunderbar show, that was also happening with his work. Like it was, you really had the feeling that, and maybe it is through this, the ability of like refuse to enter the painting, or like that anything is possible to enter the painting, that it had a kind of a glib, off the cuff attitude that was incredibly intentional and kind of hard to deal with. Not him, he was like one of the nicest people, one of the most like charismatically nice, warm people you would ever meet. But the work itself had this kind of like, yes, I'm making a painting, but no, I have no respect for painting in some way. Like, so I guess to get back to the found imagery versus like grabbing, I think everybody approaches it from different. For me, it's like every time I'm grabbing from something, it has sometimes it's a specific thing from my past that I'm interested in, like, what would this be like, to resurface this Holly Hobby image, and like 30 years ago, something I was like really attached to. And then like just also maybe a little bit similar to his impetus of like, this doesn't belong in a painting. But put all that to the side, I think there's a bigger question that you have to talk about, which is photography and painting, which is what's happening with a lot of his work and in my work. And it's just sort of like, can painting just swallow photography and you don't even notice it?
Yeah, I mean, I guess one of the other things that I was kind of attracted to with Majerus in the beginning was that, like, he was treating art history, whether it's de Kooning or Barnett Newman, Frank Stella, like treating art history and mainstream pop culture with the same level of importance, which was really exciting for me when I was younger, learning about art and kind of coming from a world of or before I moved to New York, only knowing art through skateboarding or album covers or magazines or MTV, whatever. And then to see this artist, I mean, Majerus for me in a way was almost like a gateway to learn, like when I learned about Majerus, then I kind of found Sturtevant, and then I understood Warhol better, and then I kind of learned about pictures and appropriation. And yeah, I mean, he was kind of like this, I didn't know him, I never met him, and learned about the work after he was no longer living, but it kind of seemed like there was this antenna quality that, like, the amount of information in the late 90s was kind of being distributed so much quicker, and although he was, like, his notebooks are published, he was very, very intentional about what went out, but it really seemed like anything that came in could go back out in the paintings, and it's evident in the show. But I mean, my own use of found imagery, I mean, definitely has something to do with photography, as Laura said. I mean, I studied quite closely with the photographer Christopher Williams, who is kind of deconstructing the image in his own way. But I mean, for me, when I was making this work, or even the most recent work, it's just like, it's what's in front of me. I mean, in 2016, I started making those drawings, and I was addicted to the news on my phone. And so it made sense to be taking these images and kind of seeing what happened when I was translating it through drawing. And yeah, I mean, I think not only dealing with photography, but I mean, Majerus, in an early sense, was dealing with a problem that I think painting faces now, which is kind of contending with the screen in a way, whether it's the phone or the computer. Or, I mean, that's something at least I'm thinking a lot about with painting.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point, because with I mean, the next step, there's also Photoshop that Michel Majerus actually really embraced in his work, and there's paintings literally called smudge tool, which is a Photoshop tool where you can kind of smudge the image. And so he kind of just incorporated all this, and what you mentioned about him just kind of not really caring about high and low. I feel there's also, it comes from such a place of confidence that, you know, painting still happens if you include lowbrow images. It still happens if there's the internet. It still happens if there's Photoshop.
Yeah, I think he had that ability to do that because he didn't, in a good way, he didn't take himself so seriously. He had a very minimal ego, you know, so I think he was able to approach painting from this like non-egoic place. So how it might reflect on him, like what he's using, he's not thinking of it. He wasn't, that was my impression anyway. It wasn't, whereas like, you know, simultaneous to that, you have a lot of people making paintings where it's very important what they're painting and who they are.
Yeah, and he references so many of them. I mean, he references Richter. If you have a chance to grab the Notes, which is a book of facsimile notebooks from '95, it's really interesting, where he also kind of very candid and frank of what he feels about Baselitz and kind of all the kind of heroic German painters, but huge interest in Warhol, obviously, that he quotes over and over, and that many of his works also quote. I wanted to see, so Majerus worked the majority of his life in Berlin, but he did move to Los Angeles in 2000. I don't know if you overlapped there at all, but since you have the perspective both on Berlin and Los Angeles, where you're based, I wanted to see if you could share more what the scene was like in LA, because, I mean, Majerus produced a huge number of works, his LA paintings, that are also in the exhibition, actually.
I mean, it was an interesting moment because it was a time in the 90s when LA artists were not taken that seriously, and New York was really the center of what was happening. And funnily enough, like a gallery like Neuger Rimschneider and this Kunsthaus Britannien thing, and Sharon like showing with them, and Jorge and different people sort of made this bridge happen, where there was some kind of validation from Europe happening. Also, there was a gallery in Milan that was showing LA artists. I mean, I wouldn't say they were like similar art scenes because the Berlin art scene was so incredibly new, and there was this, tension with the Easties and, like integrating painters from the East to this scene that was starting, post-wall coming down, but there was definitely this back and forth happening with LA and Berlin and a lot of German, like Jutta Kotter and Dietrich Dietrichson, and they were at coming to Art Center, they were around, and
which were also very closely connected to the Berlin music scene. That
Yeah.
I mean, Michel was also kind of immersed, at least visually. Many of his works reference that scene.
yeah. But it was very different. It was just that there wasn't, it wasn't a center. It wasn't a place that it was just becoming LA was just becoming a place you might stay after grad school. Prior to that, it was sort of like people would leave, go to grad school in LA and maybe leave, and people were starting to stick around, and but it wasn't, it's just hard to explain how different it was.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe, I mean, here we see one of the Warhol Basquiat. So with Michel Majerus' work, there's a really nice, interesting essay that talks about how he actually always aspired. He wanted to be an international painter. He was born in Luxembourg, he lived in Berlin. I mean, Luxembourg is a tiny country. And he never wanted to be referred to really as a Luxembourgish painter, but he wanted to be an international painter and really aspired to be perceived in this American context. So LA was this super important step for him, and he had the residency at Art Center. And then his first show in New York was in 2002, actually briefly before he passed away. And in '99, already in Berlin, he actually started making this series of paintings, which is a quote of the Warhol Basquiat collaboration that both artists did in the '80s at Bruno Bischofsberger, and he just added kind of his own little gesture to it. And I feel it's kind of an infamous painting, but I was curious if you could share more about this, or how you feel about this gesture and this kind of appropriation and inserting himself there.
I mean, I guess when I first saw these paintings, was when there was a big catalog of Majerus published around 2010 or 2011. And I mean, I was kind of taken back by them and was like, he didn't get in trouble for this? Like, because I don't know, I grew up...
Do you guys know about this Charlie Carpenter show with the Cabbage Patch looking kids that he did in New York? It reminds me a little bit of that. Like, it's really...
I don't know that show. Can you describe it? It's the... No.
If you know, you know.
Okay.
I mean, I guess something for me with Majerus is like, I mean, I was 10 years old when Toy Story came out, and that was the first totally computer animated movie, and felt like it really marks a time of change in the world, like into this digital moment. And I mean, I remember the transition of having a computer in the house and like the shift from like having to do homework handwritten to the computer, and like I just remember this kind of issue of plagiarism being like pounded into my head as a teenager, of like the kind of ability to now copy and paste and kind of extract from the internet and like, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it. And yeah, and then to kind of like see those Warhol Basquiat paintings was kind of like a fascinating gesture to me when I first learned about them. And again, I think it goes back to this kind of thing of when I first saw Majerus and feel like he like kind of sucked the air out of the room by writing Burned Out in a room of a bunch of like earnest painters, to see kind of like taking this famous collaboration, silk screening it, kind of using that almost as like the catalyst and the ground for a painting. And then even his own gesture on those paintings, like just this kind of like one abrupt brushstroke also feels like it's kind of sampling kind of like this ab-X confidence. So it's like nothing quite feels like it's like everything. It's like kind of like also knowing he was into music, it kind of feels like remix culture in a way. It's like anything can be taken in, scrambled, and kind of like, I guess, called his own and put it back out there for kind of a viewer to be confronted with.
I think it's notable that that with the repetition, like that feels like the real gesture is the repetition, because then you notice that this brush stroke becomes like a silk screen. It's just like, you know, I gotta go and do the brush stroke on this one. I gotta go do the brush stroke on this one, like a kind of machine.
And he did about 20.
Yeah.
And maybe that leads to another question, which is the question of speed. I mean, he worked for about 11 years, and he put out, I read the number 1,500 paintings. I don't know if that's true, but somewhere around that number. So he worked at this extremely rapid pace.
Yeah, I think that was really part of it. You know, it was sort of like, look, I'm painting. Like there was, I mean, like Christopher Williams, Stephen Prina, they were very influential to every LA artist, and probably in Berlin too, because they were being shown there, like in Germany. But like, you know, if you were a serious artist, you were a conceptual artist. You were not. So to kind of bridge over and make paintings, you had to kind of develop an attitude towards painting of why you were using it or what you were doing. And I think it's really clear in hindsight that speed was about kind of attitude toward painting.
Yeah, I mean, yesterday when I got down here and I went to see the show again, I was standing in front of that the giant overdose painting. And it was one of the first times that like a painting has produced like a noise in my head. And it was the noise of that, like when you empty the trash bin on your computer, that kind of like digital, like crunching noise. Because I don't know, for some reason it just like, and this is probably not true, but I imagined like Majerus having all this source material and like, okay, I'm gonna put the party flyer, the ice cream wrapper, Woody from Toy Story, and like, as you said, like get it done, paint it, and then like empty the trash, move on to the next thing, like make space for more sources. And yeah, I mean, I work extremely slow in comparison to this. I mean, I feel like my practice kind of almost happens in an opposite way, where I'm interested in things that already exist in culture that are kind of runaway trains themselves, and I grab it and bring it into my own studio in an attempt to kind of make us kind of slow down the experience of these things. But I mean, speed seems to be really almost one of the primary subjects in Majerus's work.
Yeah, and I think once you produce this like quantity and volume, the single work becomes less precious in a way, because you're just gonna keep moving rather than kind of, it's also, I mean, it's remarkable to get to that place, to just do something without second guessing and questioning. But as you mentioned your own work, Kyle, I would love to also talk about both of your works a bit more in detail, and where you might, I mean, you relate to Majerus from very different angles and perspectives, but where you feel like there's like a parallel or shared interest in certain aspects.
I mean, I guess I would say the thing that's, you know, not being in denial of like art that was made in the 70s and 80s is a big distinction in people who paint. Like, if you're gonna like remember while you're painting, you know, who Michael Asher is and who, you know, like who Christopher Williams is and why this all happened, you have to make a different kind of painting. So I think there's a definite overlap that I see, that I know that is something he wasn't willing to like kind of forego. Like, whereas you have a lot of people who would like to go back pre-conceptual art to kind of like continue the painting project from there.
And he did study with Joseph Cassuth, so he was very much aware of this conceptual art context.
I guess something I'm interested in Majerus is a kind of, and again, like I never saw the work when he was living, so I imagine it was like, you know, in the 90s, being able to see a painting of a character from Toy Story and also being able to see a, you know, in the same day, see a movie poster or a video game poster of the same painting in a shopping center. Like, so that kind of like feedback loop between things that are happening in the world outside of kind of call it the studio and then what's being made inside the studio, like it seemed to be like very little gaps in time.
Definitely like the subject matter, the speed, the acrylic paint,
Yeah.
the amount of paintings being made felt very like, I hate to use this word, but anti-rarefication or tour or market even. It's like, it was like working against anybody like, pinning him down.
Yeah, I mean, like, and I think it's, I mean, I have no idea, but maybe it's part of the reason why his work is not so widely shown in the United States up until now. And I mean, there's the painting in the show that says everything in Europe appears more serious. I think the fact that like he was,
But it says what?
In Europe, everything appears more serious.
which is important too, because the language is really specific. He doesn't say everything in Europe is more serious. He says it appears more serious, which is a big difference. But I mean, I think like the fact that he was painting things that were happening, like the subject matter wasn't this kind of like inaccessible, kind of like kind of high cultural concepts that sometimes people expect from art. It was very one-to-one, what you were seeing in the world around you. Like, I think the fact that he was so willing to take things that were prominent in other forms of media and bring it right into paintings and put it right back into the world. Yeah, I mean, I imagine it was kind of confrontational in some way. Or maybe not confrontational, but a bit abrasive.
Yeah, I think it didn't come across as seductive, if that's what you mean. Like,
And maybe that's also an important point because, I mean, in doing the show, I feel we've been asked a lot of times, like, why didn't he have a show in the last 25 years? I mean, he did show at Matthew Mark's, but there was no museum solo show. There were 2 group shows. LA Mocha showed an installation, and MoMA had a show about, I'm blanking on the title, something about comic and abstraction. And they showed a few of his works, but I mean, it's a very speculative question, why not earlier, why now? But I feel there might be something which you mentioned, that this pace and speed and volume, you only kind of start to understand when you see a critical mass of these works. If you see 1 or 2 of these paintings, you don't have the context. And I think you wrote something along these lines, Laura, in your essay on Majerus in the On Aluminum book, where you said, I don't think he would have shown just one painting in a group show.
no, yeah. That is true.
I've never seen his work in a group show since that pain show in 2008. Like, I've never seen it. I've only seen his work in relationship to itself ever since, so I don't know.
But do you think there's also other, I mean, I don't mean to answer my own question, but do you think there's also other factors that play in, that there's this delay and maybe there's this cultural gap that he kind of anticipated in this 91 painting where he said, well, you know, works in Europe function different than in the US, and he wrote in his notebooks, if it's supposed to be American, use more color, and if it's supposed to be European or German, use less color. And he was kind of half joking about it, but I think he was also very sincere.
Well, yeah, there was a time in LA where, Christopher Wool had a show at the Mocha and it was just panned. It was like the LA Times destroyed it because there was no color. So, I mean, it's really hard to imagine the time that was happening in the 90s and how authenticity and emotional, I don't know if you use that word, but a kind of committed investment was like almost people looking for that with a microscope. Like, does this painting a real, like one of the first reviews I got from Roberta Smith basically accused me of making fake paintings, like that I wasn't, do you know what I mean? Like, that I'd gone to all this effort to make something that wasn't authentic, and that there was an artist, I don't know if you know him, Carl Ostendarp, who along the same line got people kind of very thin, flat paint. Like there wasn't enough paint there for it to be him to be authentically believing in painting. So I guess, you know, when you're desperate to keep this medium in its kind of glory alive, you don't want anyone to take a crack at it. And he's definitely taking a crack at it, you know. So and Carl Ostendarp was as well. And I think that's one thing you could definitely say about him and about his work is like, if he wasn't having fun, if it wasn't funny, if it wasn't like, you know, there was never, I can't imagine him struggling with a painting. Do you know what I mean? Like that wasn't gonna happen. Like,
Which is amazing
yeah,
to get
Well,
to that place.
sure. But like someone I talk about a lot is Mary Heilman, who like I think also had that attitude, but in a very different way. Like she just wanted to approach painting with a very light energy, coming at it from being a ceramicist and like, you know, looking at the painting much longer than ever painting on it, and these gestures just happening. And I mean, it's very different, but it was like, that was a kind of like people trying to wrench this sort of like, I don't know what the word would be, but a kind of holier than thou like position that painting was holding, because that was actually holding painting back from itself. Because when it tried to stand outside of conceptual art and above and in this other rarefied realm, it wasn't part of art. And so I think Majerus and other people were trying to bring it back into the realm of art.
I think that's super interesting. And to just, by the way, we're also open to questions from the audience as we're kind of, I think, approaching 8, but I have one more question first. Kyle, what do you think? I mean, the timeliness, like, why it seems to be coming back, and obviously there was the kind of sad occasion of the anniversary of his passing of 20 years that, at least in Europe, brought back a lot of work and a lot of attention, and kind of a lot of them dealing with the questions like, why this work now, what remains relevant. And he made actually a couple of paintings that literally say what looks good today may not look good tomorrow. So he was kind of also,
I think his work is the opposite. Like what didn't look good yesterday looks good today. Like, like
I'm trying to find it, we might not have an image, but that's a good, I mean, that's a great take, I think. But how do you feel? I mean, what remains relevant for you, and what kind of keeps you interested in this work?
I mean, in the most basic kind of sense, his insistence on kind of figuring out whatever his questions were through painting is certainly kind of like one level of engagement for me. But I feel like there was, I don't know, maybe 3 paintings in your show here in Miami that I felt like, there's 3 paintings in the show here that I felt really kind of felt relevant to me in like a generational way, as someone who basically kind of grew up with the internet, like really as a part of my life, and kind of how, you know, all of our orientation towards these kind of life with technology has shifted. And like, I think the paintings of his names are probably the most important one for me, because they happened towards the end of his life. And it kind of seemed to be this premonition of, you know, with new technology, the pressure that was coming for the kind of individual, and especially the artist, to kind of like create a brand out of oneself. And I mean, painting his name kind of like this like semi-corporate logo seems to speak to that. And then I think maybe the last painting in the show, he's already like smearing his name out with this kind of like giant Richter-esque gesture. And that also feels relevant for kind of like maybe a little bit of a premonition of kind of like what happens to the individual once you kind of like let technology mine your life as you kind of brand yourself. And I don't know, I just think like kind of how he was just kind of absorbing and broadcasting this like big change in the world with just how quickly information was being distributed and how quickly it could go back out. And I mean, certainly working with different printing technologies towards the end of his life, like I really think for me, that's probably where I'm most engaged with the work right now. And of course, the pornography needs you painting. It kind of speaks to kind of this relationship with technology where the user is kind of bigger than the system itself.
We actually have in the background, you see this NASCAR crash, which is the crash in which Dale Earnhardt died, which was a very iconic newspaper image, which is entirely digital print on vinyl. So there exists another version of the painting, we just spoke about it earlier, where he started to copy it and then realized, oh, well, I can just print this now digitally, why would I paint it? So just again, speeding it up and
Maybe like, this is too much work.
yeah.
That kind of labor, like putting that kind of labor was also like what's that, is that called, what is that thing called? Magnifying glass. The critic coming up and looking for your authenticity when you made your painting was also, where's the labor?
Mm-hmm.
Where's the paint? Where's the labor? And so like thick oil paint, like using house paint or using vinyl or using thin, flat, matte acrylic, that was not considered, that was considered like, what is this, a joke? That did you not start your painting? Like I know, it's like we can't even see it now, but at the time it was very, I got that. I was using house paint and that was the reaction I got.
That's really interesting, yeah. And then it's also a quote to Warhol and his silk screens of the disasters.
And it kind of matches the subject matter in that way too. It's like, it's not oil paint and it's, you know, things that are surrounding us in the world already. It kind of doubles down on that kind of immediacy and the questioning of kind of like what the subject is supposed to be to make it kind of real in that sense.
But I would like to open up the floor if there's more questions, if we still have some time.
Hi, it's not really a question, just listening to you all talk, and the show is really incredibly beautiful. When I first saw it, I was really struck by the fact that the paintings are both totally innocent and informed, which I think is what both of you are saying. And then, oh, I just blanked my question. Oh yeah, it just went blank, but it doesn't matter. But this thing of, oh yes, I wanted to ask you, how do you, Laura, and you too, this thing in being innocent and informed, how do you maintain an innocence when appropriating images? Like, how do you feel about that?
I don't know that I feel necessarily innocent. Maybe it looks sort of slight and it has that appearance. You'd probably have to say more about the word innocence. I'm not really sure if I.
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately it's kind of like with a lot of appropriation, like it's kind of this degree of translation that occurs. Like, you know, there's less translation happening in certain works from pictures generation or whatever. But I mean, Majerus was always pushing, like, I don't think the source material was never a one-to-one. It was never reproduction. It was a shift in scale, a shift in perspective, a shift in palette. Like, he would start painting something and then stop painting it halfway through, maybe rendering it. And there was this kind of, there was always this, even though it was all being taken from the world, I mean, the work still has highly subjective decision-making, both on the surface, and when you look at the notebooks, there was a lot of planning that goes into these paintings that maybe is not evident. Innocence, I don't know. I mean, I don't know how to answer that, but.
I don't know, maybe there's another pairing which I've felt in like talking about the work and looking at it that came to mind for me was kind of ironic but also sincere. Because when you look at the Frank Stella, which is it's called Pressure Group, and it's this triangle, and it's huge, and it has really weird colors. It's like gray and brown, but it's so big, and it's also this very like heavy like stretcher that has a lot of depth. That it's very earnest in that way. But then again, the colors are like, oh, this is very confusing in a way. So I don't know.
He's kind of like performing painter sometimes, because I think there's something in the Notebook where there's a quote that says like, yesterday I was Frank Stella, today I am Frank Stella, tomorrow I will be Frank Stella. So it's like, I don't know, there was this performative aspect to it also, in a way.
I think there was one more question.
Thank you all, Kyle, all for being here. I had just a couple comments about his work. One is the first time I saw his work was at Petzl Gallery, where it was an entire installation of, he had these sort of like skateboard ramps and the paintings and all that. And I didn't know really what to make of it, but I knew that he was an artist, and all the artists in New York loved him, and American collectors and the American public in general didn't really get the work. I always, when I think about his work now and seeing this show, which I'm very happy that the ICA did, I think about him now as kind of like a kid in a candy store where he had the freedom to grab what he wanted from American kind of pop culture and incorporate it with, I think he had a heavy, I think he was really thinking about like artists like Ullin and Kreber. And I mean, certainly in those, with the GE logo and just putting the gesture on the canvas. I mean, I think that he had a really tight relationship to kind of almost German painting. I mean, I don't know if anyone else sees that, or maybe I'm the only one, but yeah. And even in that one painting where you guys were thinking it was kind of Richter-esque, I really saw it as very Albert Ullin. And yeah, I think he was just having a lot of fun painting. And he was really free to do it in a way that he wasn't constrained by the sorts of issues that may have constrained an American painter. That's all I wanted to say.
Mike. So, I'm sorry, I have a question. You talked about, and if you could clarify it, Laura, you talked about the idea of how like there was labor in the painting or not painting, and sort of the trend of the time versus the trend of today. And I was confused if you were saying if it was then or now. But to that point, I guess to both of you, this idea, I've been thinking a lot about this idea of texture, and even that idea of texture on the painted surface in regards to time, labor, money, the implication of that, right? So I'm wondering how both of you approach texture, maybe not exclusively in like an impasto sense, but generally, and also to clarify that timing.
I was talking about it in relationship to, like, in the 90s, critics, art criticism, specifically, there being a particular group of people, or majority of people writing art criticism that wanted to make sure they weren't being fooled by someone who didn't actually like painting, who was making a painting. Like that they were looking for like a kind of authenticity in the painting to make sure they got the real artist, the real painter. This is like someone that's going to carry the torch forward. This person loves painting. not someone who, like me, they thought like, just thought painting was a joke or something, like because of the way the paint was handled or the amount of labor that was there. So I was sort of saying that, you know, his sort of quitting the painting after he does the first corner, you know, another example of the same time would be Jorge Pardo. You know, he had an assistant who he asked his assistant to go to Dunn Edwards and get paint his office, and the assistant came in and painted and maybe ran out of paint and then went back and did a bad job matching it, and then like came and painted some more, and like Jorge was like, you know, it was a terrible job painting the office. So he said, okay, James, you're gonna stretch a canvas and you can do the same thing. This is like a perfect painting. So it's even there. It's like literally the labor is the non-labor is the mistake. And it's just like a really good example of like, that was like, to me, that was like one of the best paintings made in the 90s, you know? Merlin Carpenter does this over and over again where, what's his name? Ed was asked to like reproduce 20 paintings that supposedly was a painting that Merlin made. But like, I think treadmills in the center of the room to do your work, you know, like your workout. I guess I just see, and I think Warhol and Sturtevant, it's a certain particular movement in art that is saying this is not about the labor, it's about the idea. And so, yes, there could be a ton of labor or there could be a no labor, but that one way to signify that you kind of, the jig is up. You know, it's not about like how many hours you put into this one painting and that makes it good. Like one way of just kind of like getting past that and kind of, you know, giving the entire art world a giant enema, so to speak, is just to like make a ton of paintings. You're just gonna flush it through.
But I also think like with the speed, you know, he's like basically using like a lot of like sign painting techniques. And I mean, the digital print of the Dale Earnhardt crash, I mean, he made that in LA, and I think you basically said that was like printed by somebody who typically produced billboards for the side of the highway. So it's like, the goal is really to like get it on the surface, and sign painting techniques are about speed, not about kind of texture or quality of paint. And I mean, even seeing the Warhol Basquiat, like, it's a CMYK screen print. It like breaks down all the original texture of that work into kind of information to go through the printing process. And like the flattening, I think, is just about, yeah, getting as much out there as quickly as possible.
Well, I think that might be a great closing note from both of you. And thank you again so much. I think it was really illuminating to hear you both share your access into this work. And I think there's still so much more to be seen and discussed. There's going to be a catalog. If you feel like seeing the works again, you have a few more days down the street. The catalog is going to come out later this year. And our next in-person event is the opening of Denzel Forrester on April 5th. Thank you all for coming. Thank you.